Hi, everyone. Um, I am Deb Lavoie, and I'm from Reality Team, and I am here this week with Danny Rogers, who is the co-founder and CTO at the Global Disinformation Index. Hi, Danny.
Hey, Deb, good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too. Danny and I have known each other for several years uh, because of our mutual interest in the disinformation space. Danny, you are the co-founder, the CTO of Global Disinformation Index, as well as an adjunct professor at NYU, and many other fascinating and interesting things. Tell us a little bit about the Global Disinformation Index and what it does. And then we'll talk about how it gets into, and then we'll talk about some of the juicier stuff we have to talk about tonight.
Sure. So if we rewind back to like 2016, 2017, as this topic became front of mind for so many people, I mean, for some of us who came out of the cybersecurity and intelligence and information operations kind of world, it's not a subject that was unfamiliar to us, but it was certainly, I think, not in the public consciousness like the way it is now. And I think that so if we remember back to then, like it seemed to me one of the big things that was missing from this space was sort of somebody to be able to make the call as to like really just starting to like defining what disinformation is in a useful and productive way for the industry. We kind of looked around and said, well, in the threat space, there's a whole sort of different spectrum of motivations, from geopolitical, ideological, all the way to like financial motivations for engaging in this kind of activity. And the industry was really stuck in kind of defining what it is and in taking action against it, especially when it came up against some of the sort of more perverse business model incentives that the ad tech industry presents. And so we set out to build a kind of what we thought was needed was a transparent, independent, neutral, not-for-profit organization that could kind of be the one to make the call in an environment where commercial companies kind of couldn't or wouldn't. So that kind of set us off on the journey. So kind of how do you, sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to sort of take out some of the key points there. One is that disinformation is often quite profitable.
Yep.
One of the main ways they profit is through advertising.
Yep.
And a lot of people end up supporting major sources of disinformation unknowingly because of the way ad tech works on the internet today. Is that right?
Right. So the internet, the dominant internet business model is advertising, and at this scale, it's beyond just kind of incidental advertising the way advertising has traditionally been. Right. You have some piece of media that is a piece that is, something that people consume because they want to consume it, and then incidentally you put ads adjacent to it to monetize it. It's the way the internet has kind of fueled ad tech and juiced ad tech to where it's almost reversed. Now the entire internet is a giant ad fueled competition for your attention, and the content itself is sort of computationally enhanced. Reality itself is computationally enhanced to compete for that attention.
Right. So you started with the goal of helping companies not accidentally fund disinformation. You ended up in a space trying to figure out then, okay, well, what is disinformation? How can you identify it? And particularly, is there any way to identify it at scale, right?
Yeah, well, so that was the first, we said that the way this ad tech ecosystem works is companies pay into the big players, and it gets routed around, and it's in the big players' interest to place it wherever, and it creates this environment that incentivizes, the warping of reality for attention, which is part of what fuels disinformation. Right. And so, and in countering that, you're up against two things. Right? One is this really, really lucrative business model that fuels it, that's behind it. But even if you found the motivation to go against the business model, like, it was very clear that, people were debating, they were debating InfoWars, right? Like no one wanted to make the call. And so the industry needed, and still,
I feel good about making the call, just to be clear.
Yeah, but a lot of people in public, positions at these big platforms didn't, and still don't. And I understand where they're coming from, in the sense that they have to kind of sell to the entire public, and they're worried about, alienating part of their customer base. But and so I'll say that they need somebody to make that call.
Right.
And what's
You
needed
want
is
to be the trusted arbiter of that information.
Yeah, and I don't want to say we're the arbiter of truth, or the arbiter. What we are the ones to be able to identify, primarily for ad tech, but really for anyone who needs it, kind of what our assessment is of the disinformation risk of some particular site or some particular outlet.
Right. So at Reality Team, we try to develop credible responses to disinformation. In other words, we try to take topics that are where we're seeing a lot of lies and rumors and disinformation, and often a lot of confusion, and create really simple responses that say, actually, this is what's true. We quickly realized that, we always wanted to be very transparent about where we were getting our information. Felt that was really important. And we also wanted to make sure that the sources that we were using were credible. And then we realized that we had a big problem on our hands, right? Because as we've discussed many times, on one end of the spectrum, you have media outlets and publishers who are making a best effort to deliver credible, factual information. They will always have mistakes, right? Everyone will always do something or miss something or whatever, but they make their best effort. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people, one of whom you mentioned a few moments ago, who are making a best effort to deliberately push knowingly false information for reasons, whatever those reasons may be. In the middle, you got a lot of different stuff going on. And these days, there's even debate as to who's on the extremes. So we didn't want to do that for ourselves. We started looking out we went to see who else had already figured this out. And what we found out was that this is a hard problem and people haven't really figured it out. So before we get into...
Hence the need for a nonprofit that is transparent, neutral, independent, and tackling exactly how to figure that out. Yep.
Exactly. And that's why we kind of came to you and said, we really need some help. We started out using how do you pronounce it? Ad Fontes Media?
I have no idea.
But we quickly found some real challenges in using that material and using them as sort of the neutral arbiter of that sort of information. And we realized we needed something better. We've spoken to you about it. I want to get into some of the questions of, it seems like it shouldn't be that hard, but it is actually extremely hard. I want to get into some of the questions about that. But actually, I kind of want to step back for a second. Yesterday was an historic day in the history of the United States, and not in a good way.
A lot happened yesterday.
A lot happened yesterday. Some of it was good, actually.
It was a very long day.
It was a very long day. But the riot, attack, storming, what have you, of the Capitol was a pretty notable event. What
Correct.
role does disinformation play in creating an event like that?
Well, I mean, I think the entire event was the culmination of, you know, a years long sort of, you know, I mean, I don't even want to say like a disinformation campaign, because I feel like that is too atomic. Like, uh, you know, a years long separation from reality of a, you know, significant enough group of people, and a demonstration of the kind of seamless transition from online to offline, that, you know, shows that there's not that this sort of working assumption that it happens on the internet doesn't mean it's real, and doesn't mean it's also not happening in there's sort of a separation between on the internet and in the real world. Like, those are one and the same. The internet is the real world.
Right. It's certainly not the first example of that we've seen.
No, but it is a very, like, having, you know, the QAnon shaman standing on the Senate dais is a very, very poignant example of that.
Yes,
I mean,
certainly by
certainly,
far the most.
I would say the most visually jarring one.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's equally poignant, you know, the death of Heather Heyer, for example.
Sure.
Um,
The
but but I also would say, um, I don't know. I'm hesitant to. I think we need to be careful with the language to describe what happened yesterday, and not, you know, I actually personally take issue with the, like, using the language of insurrection. Like, insurrection implies scale and organization. In this case, I would call it like stochastic terrorism, stochastic political violence. And I, you know,
so just
and
for this audience may not necessarily know what you mean by that. Do you want to unpack that statement a little bit?
yeah, sure. So like this was a lot of sort of, you know, groundswell organized on social media, like people showing up to, you know, a violence party, and, you know, insurrection implies a goal. Insurrection implies, like, this was internet trolling come, you know, in meat space, in a very, very visible way. But, like, you know, akin to defacing the, you know, the homepage of, you know, of some highly visible
This was an
website.
emotional expression, not a strategic effort, or at
Oh,
least
for sure.
not by the actors.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's, you know, what is the end game here? Like, what do they exactly expect to change or achieve? And, you know, and I think it's almost the spectacle that really put into relief the absurdity of all of it. And the fact that Congress took a break, swept the floor, and then reconvened to finish the job, you know, by about 1 a.m, kind of points to the absurdity of all of it. You know, it was at the end of the day a minor disruption, and the institutional power of those institutions kind of rolled on as it has, which is very different than when this kind of thing happened in, like, or what they were sort of trying to recreate what happened in 1876, but like, the people voted, you know, and the outcome was definitive. So this was mostly theater.
So there was a rage party that people got invited to on the internet. The rage was due to a persistent and ongoing spread and sharing of disinformation regarding the election and other things. So there's a lot.
The rage was fomented, yes, fomented by that. Yeah, for mostly financial reasons. Like, it's all good business for everyone involved to foment that rage.
Right. So
I mean, this is why you're in the messaging business. Exactly right. It was a rage party that people were invited to on the internet, fomented purposely by a bunch of people with financial, with a lot of merch to sell, essentially.
Right, and political agendas as well, obviously.
Yeah.
All right, so disinformation.
I mean, to answer your question, like that's what fomented the rage. Like that's the role that disinformation plays.
So the reason that disinformation is, there are a lot of things that make disinformation incredibly challenging to deal with. Some of them have to do with the platforms. Some of them have to do with human psychology. Some of them have to do with the many interwoven motivations. There are many things that come together to make disinformation extremely effective. But one of the things that sort of links what you're trying to do and what we're trying to do is how hard it is to nail down what is and isn't a reliable source of information.
Right.
You mentioned earlier InfoWars. I would say that on the spectrum of things, the InfoWars is pretty clearly in the disinformation space.
Pretty clearly.
The big advertisers, and I assume you are, when you say that, you're talking about Google, you're talking about Facebook.
Well, those are the big ad tech platforms, right? The advertisers are the customers.
Right. The ad tech platforms don't want to ban them because they also make money.
Well, this gets back to, I was talking about, you said inciting rage. Like, if your goal is to get people to click on links on your website,
right,
one of the best ways to do that is to enrage them.
Right.
And if you're Facebook, those links are the links, that your customers pay you to get people to click on. If you're Alex Jones, those links are links to your supplements business. Whatever it is, getting people enraged is good for an ad-driven or an attention economy.
Right. And in fact, this gets to a point that's quite important for people to understand, which is that when they see disinformation online, they shouldn't argue with it. They shouldn't fight with it. They shouldn't interact with it, because that actually just makes it the platforms, every time a piece of disinformation gets a reaction, the platforms reward it with greater visibility. If it's an ad, they reward it with not only more impressions, but they actually lower the cost of that ad.
Right. So engagement is engagement, positive or negative.
Right.
And that's what gets rewarded in this system. And I mean, it applies even to the politics, right? Like the attention economy applies to, candidates for office. If you can keep people's attention, they recognize your name on the ballot, right? Like all of these things are intertwined and ultimately lead to like financial gain for those who can most effectively keep your attention.
Right. So there's a lot of motivation. There are a lot of reasons that, as you were saying at the beginning of this conversation, there's a lot of reasons people
do this kind of stuff.
Do this and are not inclined to pay a lot of attention, are not inclined to try to shut it down.
Yeah, and so to your point, kind of the basis of the whole conversation of like, how do you tell what a credible source is? Really, the challenge in that is comes down to trying to glean the intent of the person who has your attention. They're showing you or the publisher or the platform is showing you a piece of content for some reason, and what is that reason, and why? Pardon the visitor here. This is our lead intelligence analyst.
Hi, Katie. So actually, let's get to that, because I think that you have very clearly hit the bullseye right there. Intention. So what is easy? You participated in building a very rigorous model for helping to comb through mountains and mountains of sources to sift them into pretty credible, not so credible, high risk of disinformation, low risk of disinformation, right? So
Yeah.
what are the easy parts of that, to the extent that there are easy parts?
Yeah, I don't know that there are many easy parts. So the biggest challenge in disinformation is defining what it is. Right. That's I think that to me is the first and foremost, the first and most daunting challenge of like, what is disinformation? So especially because you're talking about like, all this stuff in the middle. These are all different ways of articulating it. So sometimes when you're having trouble defining something, the first thing you can do is define the opposite of it.
Right. Okay.
So if we're saying disinformation is somehow some kind of like, sorry, I'm trying to keep the cat out of the camera here. I apologize to our viewers here. If your challenge, sorry, if your intent is something other than trying to accurately inform your readers of some attempt at the truth, and very quickly, as we've talked about, Deb, like I love your phrase, like getting involved in an epistemological pissing match, but like, very quickly we're pulling out like our copies of Karl Popper and talking about, what is the nature of truth? Like, let's not even go there, but let's assume there is some kind of like, intent to inform your readers of the truth of some sort. Like, that is at its core, like the purpose of journalism. So if we're having trouble defining all these other motivations that people could have for spreading disinformation, let's at least start by defining the opposite of it, which is good journalism. What is good journalism?
We should make a point here. When you're talking about identifying credible sources, you're not talking about politicians or celebrities or any of that. You're talking about media outlets. So newspapers, magazines, journals,
television,
right.
Yeah, but I mean, journalism can take many forms. Bloggers,
Sure. So all of that, but not whether or not the president of the United States is a credible source.
Well, no, I mean, we're not in the fact-checking business.
Right.
I mean, fact-checking is a piece of how you accurately inform. But in our goal, again, what we've carved out for ourselves, someone who's conveying some information to somebody else, if their intent is to convey, at least good journalism at its core has as its intent to convey some piece of information to somebody else that reflects reality.
Right. So
we start
that's easy. Yeah. Is none. But there are parts that are relatively straightforward, and there are parts that are not straightforward.
Well, the first thing we do is try to define what is quality journalism, and that in and of itself is not straightforward. And we worked with Reporters Without Borders, based in Paris, as part of this whole international standards effort called the Journalism Trust Initiative, to try to define what that even is. And when you even then, when you get down into the nuts and bolts of it, there are huge regional variations in journalistic integrity and journalistic ethics. I mean, in parts of the world, it's perfectly acceptable practice to pay people to come to your press conference, right? Whereas in other parts of the world, that would be, taboo in the world of, journalists. So even just capturing a sort of global standard for quality journalism is not an easy task, but it is a task that now has been done to a sufficient enough degree that there is a standard called the Journalism Trust Initiative, and we base a lot of our methodology for manually assessing disinformation risk on that standard that we were part of the team that developed. So there's like part of the answer to the question. It doesn't really answer your question because we've answered kind of half of the question, like how do you assess journalistic integrity? And even there, you're still looking at proxies of intent. And even there, you end up in some like knotty situations. I mean, even the New York Times, which in our assessment, scores like, let's just say very high in journalistic integrity, has had this issue with one of their reporters essentially committing fraud. Now the institution itself, gave back, whatever their recent prize was, and applied their institution-wide standards to that particular journalist. But like, there are these sticky situations where an institution can have all the right intent, but individual actors within that institution may have, that was not an honest mistake. That was intentional.
So So one of the things here, though, for in this environment where we are in a society that is divided along the lines of basic notions of reality, interpretations of fact, it makes it far harder to do this job. In an environment where most people had a reasonably clear understanding of basic shared facts about the universe, gravity, round Earth, heliocentric universe, the problem was still hard. Although the ability to everybody sort of tacitly understands that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, these are credible sources, right? So yes, do they make mistakes? Certainly, and the number of times I have said, unpublishable things about stuff that has appeared in the New York Times in the last 4 years.
Or questionable guidance from the CDC sometimes. I mean, like, this is the scary thing. I always say, like, part of the reason that trust is breaking down between people and institutions is the institutions have been acting in pretty untrustworthy ways for a lot of time.
Absolutely. In a world of, say, a relatively naive world that's, say, up to 2014, where disinformation certainly existed, but it was less of a driving force in the United States.
Can I pick a different year?
Yeah.
Slightly earlier, let's say 2006.
2006. Why do you choose? Oh, I know why you choose that year, but you tell me why you choose that year.
Well, because you're talking about people enjoying a shared reality. And what happened when Facebook became people's dominant source of information is that suddenly everyone was presented with a personalized version of reality that Facebook computed to be their most engaging version. And that, to me, is the fall. Like, that's where, and then in response to that competition for your attention from Facebook, which was, dominating everyone's attention, because when you're no longer constrained by reality, like the original, Google search engine was, like Google search engine is suddenly boring. Like, the library is boring compared to, like, this amazing version of reality where all my friends are. And so then the rest of the internet had to kind of follow suit and respond to that competition. And, like, literally Google changed, like, their search engine pillars from relevance and accuracy to personalization and engagement. So, like, even the library is now rewriting itself to look more engaging to each user. And so everyone's information environment kind of took a fall around 2007 and has culminated, here we are, over a decade later. And it's no surprise that no one lives in the same reality anymore, because everyone's information environment has become completely personalized and algorithmically enhanced to show them their most engaging version.
Can we switch out the word enhanced for manipulated?
Sure, manipulated. Algorithmically manipulated, yes. Warped. Actually, I think warped is my favorite word to use.
Okay, distorted, warped. I can go with that. And we can discuss whether it's intentional, the intentionality of the manipulation or not. In fact, intention gets into a lot of here.
I mean, of course, it's intended for what felt like benign reasons, like, oh, you liked this, we'll show you more of it.
Right.
But just like, with the obesity epidemic, like, just because your brain is wired to respond to salt, fat, and sugar doesn't mean that, like, McDonald's should feed you nothing but salt, fat, and sugar. And we've learned as people that, like, maybe overindulging in certain things that trigger our pleasure centers can lead to, things that are unhealthy for us. And the same is true in our information diets. That just because we love this stuff doesn't mean it's good for us.
Absolutely. And clearly. So it's interesting that that's your reason for so I was going to say something different about why you chose that year. And then I realized that they were just two sides of the same coin, which is that there is significant evidence that foreign actors began investigating and experimenting with disinformation techniques in that time frame?
Yeah, well, but there's always been foreign actors trying to influence overtly and covertly other foreign actors and us and everyone else.
I mean, specifically
but around that time,
technical, using the platforms.
well, but around that time, they realized that all they had to do was pull out a credit card and pay Facebook. You know, like suddenly the world's most effective weapon of mass influence was available to anyone for rent, and it made all of their jobs so much easier.
Yeah, it's a doomsday machine. Anyway, back to the topic of, if we mostly agreed on reality, if this were back in 2006, how would you tell the difference between credible and non-credible sources?
I mean, maybe you, I don't know if you're trying to.
What I'm saying is, how does the disinformation environment itself make the job more difficult? And what I really am trying to drive you toward is, what are your, I know I have special information. I know what your 4 pillars of credibility are, the 4 sort of facets you look at. I think it's worth introducing those to people, and then talk about why they're harder than they look at first glance.
Yeah, so a couple things. I think a good methodology, it wouldn't matter what year it was. I think the difference between 2006 and now is just that like so much more of the public is bought into it that it makes it harder. It just adds headwind to when you're making an argument, right? Like in 2006, if Alex Jones was on the internet screaming his head off, most people would have like laughed at it, and he wouldn't have got, or most people wouldn't have even seen it. Now, I mean, part of this is a consequence of like the shift from a one-to-many communication model of broadcast to a many-to-many communication model. Like if Alex Jones was shouting on TV, 30 years ago, like the gatekeepers of the one-to-many broadcast model, just no one would have ever seen him. He would have been the guy typing up the newsletter in the basement and mailing it out to his 20 subscribers, like in that movie, whatever, with Mel Gibson or whatever. But like, because now he has this distribution system that anyone can access, like suddenly you can build up mass. He can find fellow travelers much more easily and feed them the diet.
And there's all sorts of indoctrination and
right
on the path.
Right, but
talk about these pillars. What is it that?
So what I'm saying is these pillars should apply whether it's 2006 or 2020 or 2021. That like the idea is there's structural elements, there are content elements, there are operational elements, and there are contextual elements, and all of these things are around trying to glean intent, some intent other than properly informing your readership.
So I want to go back to talking about what those are. Is it okay to talk about what those are in general?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So because I think that when people themselves try to understand the media they're looking at and whether or not it's credible and how to think through those issues, we're not going to get into a huge amount of detail here, obviously, but super helpful to understand. So you said structural, operational,
content and context.
Structure, operation, content, context. So what are structural issues that reflect on the credibility of an organization, of a media outlet?
Yeah, so these are kind of like these are, again, all of these are sort of ways to glean intent or glean the risk of a malicious intent somewhere.
Right. So you're trying to say if you have these factors, you're probably trying to do a good job. So
and if you're trying not to do a good job, it'll show up in one of these ways.
Right.
And I should be clear, by the way, like you said something before about sharing truth, like someone who intends to share truthful things. Like I think this idea of malicious intent, of adversarial nature of a narrative, and I think equally importantly, a risk of harm, which is something that doesn't get emphasized enough, are key to understanding the difference between disinformation and like the NORAD Santa tracker. Like on Christmas Eve, the US military engages in a very, very organized and concerted effort to spread a lie that Santa is flying around the world in a sleigh carried by pulled by reindeer. Like, it's not true. I'm sorry to, disappoint our viewers this evening, but like,
we'll put a warning on the front of that.
spoiler alert. But there's nothing malicious or adversarial, and there's no risk of harm necessarily in like talking about Santa Claus. So what we're trying to do is capture various elements where we would find some motive other, some malicious adversarial motive with a risk of harm that's other than good journalism. And so structurally speaking, for example, if you look at literally the core infrastructure that runs CNN.com versus the core infrastructure that runs, the Gateway Pundit, like they're very different.
What do you mean by that? So how should a normal person think about structural issues? Like, how would you define it to your mom?
Well, for us, I don't know that a normal person might interpret the idea of structural issues more in the language we would use for what we call the operational issues, which is more like, what sort of journalistic integrity policies do they have in place? Do they issue error corrections? Like that's maybe what you call structural. What we call structural is more technical.
It's journalistic standards, right?
Right.
So journalistic standards involve things like having standards for sources and fact checking and
error correction and editorial, right. Sorry, go ahead.
So ways to report errors, they correct errors when they find them,
right?
That sort of thing. They're transparent about their editorial
policies. They're transparent about their ownership, right? Who owns the site? How much influence does the owner have on the editorial, right? Like, are the editors taking direct orders from their owners, or like as has been documented in the case with outlets like Breitbart, or has there been like generally documented independence of the editors from the owners, as in the case of the Washington Post?
Okay, so then that goes into sort of operational issues. So what are some of the operational issues that you think of, or did we sort of cover those already?
I mean, that's what we call our operations pillar. Like, are they transparent about their ownership? Are they transparent about, like, do they have, a set of core journalistic standards in place? Do they issue corrections? Things that indicate quality journalism. That the operational part is the part that's most heavily based on the Journalism Trust Initiative standards and that kind of stuff.
So then content, talk about what people should be thinking about in terms of, what makes for credible content.
Yeah, so we do kind of, expert assessments of samples of content to look for things like, bias and clickbait and, like hit pieces, like, is this punching down against somebody, or, is this like a balanced take, or is this a highly biased take? Is it sensationalized? Like just different aspects of the content, and specifically we try to focus that around sort of content themes where we see the most likely targets of disinformation, things like health and politics and climate and things like that, like places where we've seen more adversarial narrative conflict, right? Like celebrity gossip, maybe not so much, but so an outlet could be full of celebrity gossip, but then have like virulently anti-vax content mixed in there. And so we try to focus that content analysis in the places.
So, what topics are they covering? How are they covering them in a way that includes a lot of incendiary language or words?
Right.
Are they citing sources, or are they just making stuff up?
That sort of thing, yeah.
That sort of thing. And then context.
Context is, and this is one we've debated a lot, and we sort of, it's kind of like how their readership, and we do this using surveys, like I'll give you an example. A site can issue error corrections, but does anyone see them? So we survey the readers, say, when was the last time you saw this site issue or correct an error?
Oh, that's going to be tough.
Well, we choose our survey respondents carefully, like regular readers of certain outlets of each outlet. But like, it's just interesting, and these often, how they get worked into a score is, something that is a work in progress. But that's what we mean by contextual indicators.
Got it.
Do people who read this publication trust it? I mean, do they trust it? I mean, I'll tell you, like, there's been some interesting studies, not done by us, but others in the space, that like most of the people who read InfoWars think it's not a credible source themselves.
So they do it because it's fun?
Yeah. And why not? I mean, for them, it's a blast, right? What a fun world.
Sure. Okay. So this stuff is hard. We've sort of discussed that. I sort of explained how we knew that we wanted to be transparent and have good sources ourselves. So we went out and we tried to find what models already existed. What we were really hoping to find is, give us a list of 1,000 media sources ranked, right?
Mm-hmm. We're working on it. I mean, we have a lot of it, but
right. And so based on some of the work that you did, some of the work that NewsGuard did, some other things, we sort of pulled together on our site a page on credible sources. Mm-hmm. Look here first, here's some other sources, this, that, and the other thing. And it was our current iteration of that page, trust these sources more than these other sources. And we call out very few sources not to trust, but we do call out a few. Is 100 times better than what it replaced. But I asked you to take a look at it, and your first response was, "Oh no, this is terrible."
It's a really hard problem.
Right.
And
so, go ahead.
No, it's a really hard problem, and one that our whole organization is dedicated to doing. It even gets even harder when you try to scale it.
Right.
And we've managed to apply some techniques for the folks for our partners who rely on it most heavily, but it's not trivial. I mean, it's taken us years and significant investment and a decent team.
How many media outlets have you evaluated?
Well, it depends on what methodology. I mean, we use a combination of automated kind of machine learning based techniques for certain aspects of it, and manual assessment techniques for things where the automation falls down. So right. Manually
assisted
we've done. Sorry.
So you have you grind through what can be automated, and then you have humans do the part.
Assess the things that were that either can't be automated or need a second look.
So have you looked at hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands? I mean,
so if including the automation, we've looked at on the scale of 100,000.
It's a lot.
Yeah. So, yeah. If you include the automation.
As we kind of wrap up here, because we wanted to end a little bit early tonight, I kind of want to ask you, we're in a tough information environment, right? People do not have a shared sense of reality. And while there are some people who have been indoctrinated into one of several false realities, there are some people who are pretty solidly based in a universal set of fundamental demonstrable facts. there are a lot of people who don't know how to tell the difference. They are not particularly indoctrinated. They have not particularly spent a lot of time thinking about these things. In particular, a lot of young people fall into this category because they don't have a lot of perspective or experience to use to evaluate information. What
do you have,
do you tell people?
First of all, do you have data for that? Because I actually think you do, that it's young people that, because I feel like a lot of the sort of the more digital native generation, or now generations, have better instincts in navigating the sort of the many to many communications model.
So it's interesting. I thought you were asking a different question. So I have a lot of data that says, so I have pretty good data from Pew Research that I can share with you that speaks to the fact that more than 50% of adults in the United States think it is hard to tell the difference between what is true and what is not true, particularly in certain realms.
Yep.
And really everyone falls into that category in many realms, because we're not all experts in all things, right? We have to rely on others in, for, battery technology or whatever it is, right?
Of course.
Vaccine information. That confusion, that lack of confidence that they can tell the difference is relatively consistent across age groups. However, young people tend to get more of their information online, a lot more of their information online. When they do, particularly those who are not news nerds, those who aren't really engaged in news, tend to be online a lot and are exposed to a lot of disinformation as a result. And there is a slight bias there toward young women in particular, who do not know who to believe, do not read a lot of news, and what they do read is mostly what they get online. And that puts them in a very vulnerable place.
And so that, yeah, I completely agree. And so interesting. So and so the question is what advice, how to tell the difference, basically, like how to navigate that? Is that the question?
What are the things that normal people should be asking themselves when they're trying to figure out if a source is credible or not? And what should they do if they're not sure?
Oh, it's tough. This is what we're trying to fix.
Well, right, exactly.
The first thing I would tell people is, given the state of online, given the state of our information environment, I can almost guarantee you that reality is probably 25% less exciting than it looks online. At least. Oh, let's just say less. I won't put a number on it, but reality is probably less exciting than it looks online. So if you're looking at a source and everything is very extreme, there's lots of exclamation points, there's lots of like it's very, like, if you're finding yourself getting very excited in one direction or another, then that is probably the intent of that site, to get you very excited in one direction or another. And I think about, even reading sites like the Daily Beast, or even Huffington Post or whatnot.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Like these are sites.
The more your emotional responses start to jangle, the more you should be skeptical.
The more you should make sure you think twice. Give it a thorough read. Think, take a step back and say, is it really that extreme? And sometimes it is, right? I mean, this has been the 4 years.
A lot of exclamation points, and they were not lies.
Right, yeah, I mean, and not even lies, but there's been a lot of days in the last 4 years where there have been big all caps headlines on the top of, major newspapers that you would not have expected. I mean, that's another thing, like find a major newspaper, like find a quality newspaper, local or national, support it, believe it. Like there is good journalism out there. I mean, we identified, half a dozen sites leading up to the election that, like we said, you can trust these. You can trust National Public Radio. You can trust the New York Times. You can trust the Wall Street Journal. You can trust the Washington Post, right? Like you can trust USA Today. These are reputable newspapers that have been around a long time, that have good journalistic standards. And sometimes there are very exciting things that they put all caps headlines on the tops of their front pages about. But like, when every single thing is doomsday apocalypse, or, can you believe this crazy thing happened on every headline? Like, you got to wonder. And you can say, when you feel like you're reading the newspaper and every story is, something emotionally charging, like odds are reality isn't quite that emotionally charging unless every day was like yesterday.
Right. And let's hope it isn't, because
which thank God it's not.
So this is a conversation that is far from over. We have barely scratched the surface, even in the topics we covered in this little bitty hour.
I mean, I've been working on this full time for years, Deb. If we solved it in one 45-minute Facebook Live conversation, then
we could all go home.
I've been doing it wrong.
This is a hard conversation. We encourage people to, number one, don't let your guard down. We all get fooled. In fact, on our team, we are actually making a collection of the things that fooled us. And some of them are really dumb. I got fooled by something that was actually satire just because I was so ready to believe it. And literally all I would have had to do is click on the profile and see that it was a comedian, right? We all get fooled, and that thinking that only dumb people get fooled and only uneducated, ignorant people get fooled really underestimates how good disinformation is at getting us, right? Yeah. Don't underestimate it. Don't underestimate yourself. Don't overestimate yourself. You will probably get fooled sometime. You will certainly get fooled sometime. That's okay. But let it remind you to do a little bit of a check. We have something on our site that says, how to do a 30-second fact check, and who to ask if you're not sure. Try never to be too sure.
And we're back to pulling out Karl Popper and remembering that we can't ever really know anything. We can never really prove anything. All we can do is disprove things.
Well, yeah. One of the questions we started talking about, and I know we got to go in a sec. A couple weeks ago, we were having a conversation, and I said, do we really have to define some epistemological, high-level, objective truth in order to be able to tell what is credible and what is not? And I say that you don't.
No, this gets down to the philosophy of it, right? But we can never really know the truth, but it's not about knowing the truth. It's about, having the right intentions on the journey to getting there.
Right. Are we doing our best to see the world as it is and to understand the implications of that? Or are we trying to force you to see something in a distorted or just completely fantastic way?
Right.
That's kind of ultimately what you need. And of course, there's a lot of bias and culture and other stuff that makes that messy.
Yep.
But ultimately, it's about best effort at the truth. You don't actually have to define an ultimate truth. Danny, I want to thank you very much. We went a little bit past where we hoped to be, and we really want to thank you for joining us this evening. And I look forward to a lot more conversations with you where you can beat up our model of our credible sources page and hopefully drive it toward better, more reliable, easier to deal with over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. We may not have solved the problem tonight, but we have rederived the enlightenment, and that alone.
There you go. We are rederiving enlightenment. Perfect.
Yep.
Good night,
Thanks,
Dan.
Deb. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Thanks everyone for showing up.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye-bye.